Okay, we're back with another Scaper app from Igor Vasiliev. Now it may be that you've seen my previous video on FieldScaper, and if you thought FieldScaper was complicated, well, strap in, because this one's going to make you dizzy. I'm not going to attempt any pretense of a comprehensive review or tutorial or walkthrough of this app. That would be unthinkable. What I'm actually going to do is just kind of roam around the landscape of SynthScaper, if you like, and see what we can see. There's just so much going on here that it's hard to keep it all in your head, so I've probably forgotten half the things I was going to say. So what is this app? Well, it's a 3-oscillator synth, essentially. Now, I'm using the word oscillator because that's the word that Igor uses. This is not oscillator based. This is not like your analog synth. It doesn't actually generate noises itself. It's based on samples. Igor calls these sample-based oscillators. So whenever I say oscillator, you just got to understand that as the source of a sound, the noise maker, and we've got 3 of those. I'll go through this screen in detail in a second, but at the moment those 3 oscillators are represented by these 3 kind of flower looking items arranged on this sort of black background. This is a preview of what's going on here. That's a kind of a 2D bird's eye view of the soundscape, and the listener is the bottom center. Now each of these oscillators has 3 layers to it, and that essentially means that when you hit a key you can have 3 different samples playing in parallel for each oscillator. So that's a total of 9 different samples that can be playing, and of course you can have no end of, almost infinitely complex processing of those samples with filters and delay effects and all sorts of other things. So there's 3 layers per oscillator. Now each of those layers has 6 voices, up to 6 voices. That essentially means it's 6-note polyphonic. So that sample will play up to 6 different instances for each of those 9 samples every time you hold down a key. So to summarise, that's a total of 54 different noises happening every time you hold down a key. Technically up to 18 different notes can be playing at the same time. So that's, I think, numerically what we've got going on. So let's look at this main screen. As I say, we've got the 3 oscillators. I'll take you around this screen because it's a little bit bewildering at first, but it's relatively logical up to a point. So this is the sort of main bulk of the screen is this 2D soundscape, and you can just drag with your finger these oscillators to be anywhere you want, and intuitively, if I just I'm jumping ahead here, but let's see, if I mute by pressing the little M to the top right of each of those oscillators, you can mute them. So I'm going to mute 1 and 3. So only 2 is playing, and if I just hold that note and drag left and right, you can clearly hear what's going on there, which is it's as your intuition would suggest, moving it to the left or right of the soundscape. You can move it closer or further away. There's other things going on there as well, which are consequences of the processing that's going on, but that's essentially what the 2D representation does. If I just go back to that oscillator, I'm highlighting it by just clicking on it with my finger. You can see that sort of petal-like arrangement is split into 3 120-degree arcs. That's to represent each of the 3 layers within that oscillator. And there's a little handle on there. This is quite cumbersome actually, and you wouldn't want to do this very often, but there's a little handle which you can click and drag. The problem is when your finger's on it, you can't see it. And that essentially adjusts the level. You can hear that changing the level. I'll try one of the other levels. See, I can't drag it, I can't grab it. It's hard. That one's not so obvious. That one's doing something. So that's the only control you have on this screen of the oscillators. We'll get to the oscillator screen in a while. That's the heart of this app really. But let's take you on the rest of this screen. If I just unmute those. Over to the left of the screen, the sort of top half of the left hand side, that's split into 3 identical regions, one for each of the oscillators. And we've got 2, what have we got there? We've got the name of a oscillator preset. That's the thing in the dashed box. If you click on that, it brings you to the oscillator preset selection screen. We'll look at that later. Below that, we've got 2 buttons labelled OSC and FLT. That's oscillator and filter. Now those are where all the work of this app is done. So oscillator brings you to that screen, which I'm just going to put away because that's for later. FLT brings you to that screen, which is also a fascinating screen, which we're going to look at later. Arguably that should be called effects, not filter, because it's more than filtering. That's where you can get to your delays and ring modulation and all sorts of things. Below that, we've got a button that says ARP. That brings you to a screen with arpeggiating controls. The little red flag to the left of that button means that oscillator 1 in this preset does have a arpeggiator in use. Then below that, there's a thing that says KB and a bunch of numbers. If you click on that, that gets you into some of the keyboard setup. We might look at that later as well. And then the last thing below that is a row of lights really, and those show you which voices are active for that oscillator. So then we've got that block of information that I've just gone through for oscillator 1 is repeated for oscillator 2 and oscillator 3. The only real differences there are we've got different preset selected for oscillator 2, a thing called organomatic instead of doorbells, and then for oscillator 3 we've got a thing called absent men selected. So those are just the names of the presets. Over to the right hand side of the screen, we've got start button is to do with arpeggiation. We're not going to look at that for now. That's a subtlety. We've got in-trap audio 120 beats per minute as the internal clock selected. Now we can sync that to external MIDI clock. We've got Ableton Link and all sorts of things. That parameter comes back to us in many of the dialogues for setting up the effects, which can be linked or not linked to the MIDI clock, and that makes a difference. But that's a familiar idea, you should be aware of that. We've got a dialogue for handling files. One thing I'll say here is there's a couple of things I'm specifically not going to look at in this walkthrough of SynthScaper. One of them is the preset designer, which is a fantastic and very rich, I suppose, artificially intelligent device for coming up with your own presets. That's worthy of a whole video in its own right, so I'm not going to look at that. I'm also not going to look at using your own samples. So everything I do today is going to be based on samples that come with this. Now this comes with a huge array of samples, 470 samples, many of which, more than half, are actually samples from classic synthesizers. There's some other instrument sounds and some slightly less musical sounds. But the files dialog is for managing the import of your own audio sounds. So that's all I'm going to say about the files. There's a setup dialog there, which I'm not going to dwell on. There's the help screen, which, well, you need to read through this. It's helpful, but it's not complete, certainly by any means. But it is worth reading it carefully. The English is a little bit idiosyncratic, so it's kind of sometimes difficult to get the subtleties. But it's there. It's hyperlinked, and it remembers where you were when you reopen it, which is a great feature. So that's the help. There's an internal recorder, which is this dashed box underneath that, which I'm not going to use today, but you can record stuff as you're playing it and then I guess export that if you want. We've got reverb on. If I just tinker with that, I hold down If I switch reverb off with that reverb button at the bottom and then on again, where you can kind of, I mean this is a kind of vibey preset anyway. Let me just choose a simpler one. So we should hear reverb. That's without. Switch it on. And then we can increase the space and the reflections. Okay, so that's reverb. Let's just go back to that. So that's pretty much it for the top part of the screen. The designer, there's a button called design. That's where you get to the preset designer. Won't look at that. The preset loaded is at the top of the screen. I should say there's two different kinds of presets. We're looking at presets for oscillators, and then we're looking at presets for the I think he calls them scenes, for the particular selection of an arrangement of oscillators. So if I were to just click on that top there, if I go to, well, you can select different presets here. Some of them, this one's only got two oscillators. If you look to the left, one of them says init, and actually on the screen oscillator 3 has the M mute button pressed because it doesn't do anything. That's quite a nice one actually. But I want to just go back to the one I originally had loaded. Yeah. So we're back at the preset I had loaded at the start, which is a 3 oscillator preset. So that's the top half of the screen. What we need to look at now is the bottom half of the screen. And I'm going to go through this in some detail because this is about the keyboard, the built-in keyboard. So far I've just been pressing my MIDI keyboard. I'm going to look at the on-screen keyboard now, and this, one of the reasons for doing this in some detail is it just gives you an idea of the depth of thought and attention to detail that's gone into this app. The one thing I don't like about this keyboard is the colour. You can't change the colours. It looks like a kind of circus tent or something like that, but it's relatively conventional in its layout. You know, it's a piano keyboard. The darker stripes are the black keys. Let me choose a different preset for this. That's a nice one. So we've got keys, white keys, black keys. I can press and I can drag. You'll notice there's a horizontal bar up here when I press as well. If I drag up and down, that controls a modulation parameter. By default it controls the first effect in the effects chain. If we just preview that, the first effect is a low pass distortion filter. It's kind of subtle here, but I'll try it again. Yeah. So you can hear that. So that bar moves up and down when you drag it. This is a multi-touch keyboard. I press 2 keys at once to try and get it somewhat melodic. When you use multi-touch, you only get one horizontal bar, or you get 2 vertical bars where you've pressed the keys. But there's only one horizontal one. That's always controlled by the leftmost finger that's touching the keyboard. So the leftmost finger controls the modulation parameter. We can control the octaves that are on display. If you look in the middle of the screen, we've got the number of octaves. So if I click 2, the keys get skinnier and we have more of them. 3, even more. If I go the other way, they get bigger. It's just easier to play. But by default, we've got, was that it? To the left of that, you can see which octaves we're seeing. So if we go down by just clicking those little buttons to the left and right, we've got some little round buttons to the right of that. What do they do? Well, this is very interesting. This is, we'll go from left to right with those. In fact, we won't do that yet. We'll do those buttons in a minute. The other thing you can do with the keyboard is you can split it in two. So we've now got 2 different ranges. They're independent, so we can map those to different things, different octaves. Almost anything you can think of to do with the mapping of keyboards, you can do independently for the split keyboard. You'll notice we've got separate control of the modulation parameters there. The other thing we can do is if I turn that split back off, we can make the keyboard larger by clicking height, and then instead of split we've got double. So we've got 2 keyboards, again they're independent, but just in a different arrangement. Arguably that's easier to work with. Of course, you can map all of this to your external MIDI keyboards with enormous flexibility as well. But for now, we're looking at the internal keyboard. Single again, and turn height off. So back to these buttons to the right hand side of the keyboard. V is, now if I just do it without V, V is a sort of emulation of velocity sensitivity. Now the iPad screen isn't velocity sensitive, but this manages to make it kind of velocity sensitive. I expect he's doing that with some very careful I don't know how the touch sensing works, or the multi-touch, but it may be that it can sense the size of the contact patch or something, and if you hit it harder that contact patch is larger. But it's very clever, and it makes a difference. If I turn that off, and then play that with velocity sensitivity, should be able to get more finesse. Well, it's subtle, but it's there, and it's kind of amazing. The R is, I'm not quite sure what this does. This is something to do with introducing randomization into the velocity. Normally, if everything's off, the velocity is just constant. I think the velocity is denoted by that filling in of that triangle just above where the key is hit. If I put that to random, not sure about that. Something to do with random. The R stands for random. Something is random. M is very interesting. Now this is, you won't maybe quite get this until you think it through. When I hit the key, I'm hitting the key with my finger. You can't see this, towards the top of the range, but that horizontal modulation bar always appears in the middle. I'm hitting it towards the bottom, appears in the middle. If I turn M on, that modulation bar appears where my finger touches the screen. If I have that M switched off, M stands for modify, wherever I touch the screen, the modulation always starts in the central position, then I can modify up or down by dragging. If I turn M on, the modulate, if I happen to know that that's a low pass filter, I know that the hitting the key nearer the top starts that note with a lower cutoff, or if I hit it near the bottom, higher cutoff. So that's just a subtlety. That's to me a very clear indication of incremental design. it's probably started off without that flag, and then Igor's decided, do you know what, wouldn't it be nice if, and then he's added that in. The next one along is P, which stands for pitch bending. This is, we've got a bit of glide going on between these. If I choose one that's not got any glide, it's more obvious if I choose this preset. If I turn P on, if I click and drag, it bends the note. If I multi-touch, if I go for a chord, and again multi-touch, it only responds to the leftmost finger with the click and drag. That's a chord, it bends both the notes in proportion. And of course the modulation still works as well. Modulation seems very subtle on this preset. So that's great, but it doesn't stop there. If I click C as well, that stands for, I don't know, C, continuous or something like that. What it does is it modifies the behavior of that multi-touch with respect to the pitch bending. If I click that chord again, I can now bend each note independently. Don't know what that does without. It's not clear to me how C differs from P, actually. You get a different graphic with the P. I suspect this is a subtlety that's going to be lost on me until I try and actually make a real preset, and then the subtlety will probably become obvious. Now all of those things work with the split keyboards as well. So if I turn on, now actually having said that, some of those buttons actually disappear when you split the keyboard. They are still active, but you have to set them before you split the keyboard. So if I put on P and C and M, we now split the keyboard. So the M means that we get the modulation starting where we hit the key rather than in the center. That happens independently on each of the two keyboards. We've got the pitch bending. Oh, that's interesting. The pitch. Oh, no. There again, I was about to say that that's not as flexible. The pitch bending and the continuity are turned off independently on the left-hand keyboard. They're now on. So we've got independent pitch bending. If I am trying to use 4 fingers here, we've got 2 independent pitch bends on each side. In fact, we can turn off the independent pitch bending on the secondary keyboard. So on the right hand side, they'll bend independently, those notes. On the left, they're in step following my left finger. I hope that makes sense. It's just crazy. It's flipping crazy. And you can change the octave, obviously, independently, which is one of the reasons you might want to split the keyboard. Is that everything to say about the keyboard? No, that's not quite everything to say. Let's go back to my other preset. The last thing I'll say is the modulation parameter that's controlled by that click and drag. Now this is just a good example of why you need to look at the documentation for this. You'd never find this, or it would, you'd never find it if you were looking for it. I know that because I couldn't. But To find where to change this modulation parameter, just to remind you that on this preset only oscillator 2 is active, the other two are empty and they're both muted. So if we go into the oscillator 2 section at the middle of the screen to the left, this line that says KB, if we click on that, this takes us into the keyboard setup. Now some of this you can figure out for yourself, so I won't go into it, but if you look at this tab that's labelled modulation velocity, if you click that, again, every time you discover a new dialogue in this, it's mega complicated. But if you direct your attention to the top left of this tab where it says main mod, now that means the modification control for the main keyboard. If you've got this connected to your MIDI, that would be the modulation wheel typically on your MIDI keyboard. But on this screen keyboard, it's the up and down swiping of your leftmost finger. And so under main mod it says main controls effect 1 value. So effect 1 value, I happen to know is the, well, I think we sneak peeked it earlier, it's the first effect in the chain of effects, which happens to be in this case a 24 dB distortion filter, I think. If I click on that, it allows me to change that to the second effect in the chain or to the level. Let's try level instead. So this is with effect 1, it sounds like this. I'm swiping up and down there. With that as level, it sounds like this. With effect 2, so that's different. I don't know what level, I don't know what effect 2 is. So that's all I'm going to say about that for now, and I think that's all I'll say about the keyboard. But I think you'll agree that just the attention to detail in that design of that keyboard is just flipping vast. So the last couple of things on this screen, if we look back towards the SynthScaper area, we've got a row of buttons along the bottom. Some of these are conventional. Hold, I click that. Oh, this is not good. If I choose a different preset, hold on. If I press a key and then hold, hands off, it continues to run. Now there's 3 independent buttons that have lit up green for each oscillator. If I can unhold a particular oscillator, so now only oscillator 1 is running. I think res is reset. I think that's like I think it says in the manual that's like the MIDI panic button. It just cuts everything. The hold button is still pressed for oscillator 1. So everything's going, but if I take my hand off the key, oscillators 1 and 3 stop. 2 and 3 stop. That's interesting. That didn't do what I expected. Actually, what that seems to do is not what I expected. That seems to do more than just the hold function. If I select just oscillator 2 on what I think is the hold area, that seems to mute oscillators 1 and 3, so it only plays oscillator 2. That's a good function actually. So that's kind of a way to mute without pressing these M buttons. You see, there's just hidden depths in this. And I think if you're holding I've forgotten what the add button does, but you can look that up in the documentation. Mute just mutes everything. auto is interesting. You see this level over to the right. That, if you drag that triangle, it's just the volume control. But if you click auto, I've never seen this before. This is like an auto level control on a recording device. It varies the level setting to try and, I guess, keep a more or less constant output volume. So if we were to just play the quiet sounds, that's quite quiet, it's relatively subtle. But if we turn auto on, so that's what that does. That's pretty much the whole of this main screen. I think just one thing I missed, if I click on the BPM, we get the MIDI sync or clock sync setup. I won't say anything about that. That's a very familiar dialogue if you're familiar with these kind of apps. Okay, time to look at the engine room of this synthesizer, and that's the oscillator design and setup. So what do we have? We've got a 3 oscillator setup here. This is a nice preset. This is a fully elaborated soundscape or scene, if you like. So we've got 3 oscillators, each of which has its own setup. We'll look at a couple of these. One of them's got an arpeggio built in, and we can drag these around to change the general setup. So let's try muting these. So we'll just, oscillator 1 alone sounds like this. So that's the arpeggiated sound. So for our purposes, not that interesting. We'll listen to oscillator 2. That's a sort of swelling pad-like sound. Look at that in a minute. Oscillator 3. Let's look at oscillator 3. So if I click on the OSC button, we get, in fact, we get a, I mean, this screen is just gloriously complicated, and we're going to look at this in moderate detail, I suppose. Although I clicked on the OSC button for oscillator 3, we're actually getting a dialogue that shows all the oscillators. Now that's a little bit questionable in terms of user interface design, but you know, we can live with that. If you look at the row along the top, we can select between them and you can see the screen changes. These are, I suppose, like a tabbed dialogue in Windows. We can also see the 2 oscillators 1 and 2 are muted. You can click those M buttons that mutes and unmutes them. So this tab is now displaying oscillator 3. What can we say about this? Well, the first thing below that is we've got what is sort of like another tabbed dialogue. We've got layers independently. We can have layers 1, 2 and 3, and again you'll see that as I click those, there are some subtle differences between the layers, particularly the setups of the octaves. Actually, do you know what? For the moment, I'm just going to flip out of this and select a different preset for a reason which I'll tell you about in a second. Which one shall I choose? Let's go for this one. It's got a very weird name, this. I kind of like this preset. Now the reason I chose a different preset to illustrate this is we're looking at oscillator 1 of this preset. We're looking at, and if we flip between the layers 1, 2 and 3, the thing I'm interested in is that in that dashed square box immediately below the layer designation, you'll see that each layer has a different sample loaded. The other one, it used 3 variants of the same sample. So this will allow me to go in and just show you, this is these 3 are all synthesizer samples. If I just load them, if I click on that dashed box, it brings me to the sample selection page and I can play the naked sample. So it sounds kind of uninteresting. If I click layer 2, that sample, it's kind of the same, but it's shorter, but these loop. Layer 3. Now that one's interesting. It's relatively simple sound, but it's got some phasing actually built in. Now that raises a whole other thing. Many of these samples have effects already applied to them, which in a sense add to or are modified by the effects that we then apply to the sample. If I just look at this list of samples, this is the synths samples. You'll see there's hundreds, literally hundreds. I think there's 195 in this particular group. So Roland, some of them are boring. Some Korg, it's more interesting. N-Sonic, it's kind of a Hammond organ sound there. Clavi, Nord, modular, blah blah blah. Should find some Moog samples in there. Oh, whoops. Polymoog, Micromoog, and so on. So I'm going to go back to my original, this is my original demo. We turned off 1 and 2. We're going in to look at oscillator 3. So you can see that each of the 3 layers in this oscillator have got the same Roland synth sound, but layer 1 modifies the pitch by 2 cents, which is minus 2 cents, which is 2/100ths of a tone, I think. It'd be helpful if I played that. So layer 1 on its own, layer 2 on its own. So that's 1 octave lower, 3 semitones lower, 2 cents lower. Layer 3, an octave higher, and so on. There is an argument that intuition is helpful in a user interface. I don't think it's an essential in a user interface. It's helpful, it's a leg up, because it calls on your real world or other domain knowledge. That's what intuition is, if you read about it, to help you begin to use or become familiar with a new application. That's the basis of the whole Windows user interface, and that's fine. But some of this app is somewhat intuitive because it, necessarily the domain knowledge transfers from anything else to do with synthesis or sound processing. But for many of the other features, you're not really going to have any intuitions about how to understand them. Well, I say that this particular screen, maybe the Death Star's within firing range or something. But it's pretty difficult to understand this display to the left. I will say another thing about this. I'll explain this. This circular ray. I mean, I think it's quite a beautiful user interface, and once you understand it, it's very economical and quite brilliant, actually. But that said, how can we explain this? The circle to the left. This is directly related to that petal-like image on the soundscape on the main screen, in that we've got 3 120-degree segments which relate to the 3 layers. Now I think actually what will be more intuitive here is when you selected a layer, you saw the one single segment relating to that layer and you didn't see the other 2 segments. That's not how it happens. You continue to see all 3 layers. They are numbered. Those numbers, if you look to the center of that circle, we've got 1, 2, 3. That 1, 2, 3 is the layer number. So if we look at the top segment of that circle, arbitrarily that refers to layer 2. We have a number of things going on there. The orange triangle denotes the balance. So that sound, when that is centered, and you can drag that, when that's centered, the balance left and right of the sound will be centered. If you're listening to this on headphones, you should get that. If I drag that left and right, you should hear that balance change. So it's gone over to the left, over to the right. Now it doesn't completely, it's relatively subtle. It doesn't completely obliterate the left when I drag it all the way right, and so on. Now the other reason that was subtle, I'm only panning layer 2. If I mute layers 1 and 3, that's layer 2 on its own. If I do that panning again, oops, changed the wrong thing there. Okay, so that's the first thing. Now the green triangle below it, which it happens to be moving, which is, I've got to explain two things at once. The green triangle denotes the current value of that balance parameter. Now the reason it's moving is it's actually assigned to an LFO, a low frequency oscillator. If we look down to the bottom right of this dialog, we see that for every layer on every oscillator, we've got a number of parameters. We've got the level, the balance, a low pass filter, a high pass filter, something called address, and something called pitch. Now in passing, it's my favourite phrase, in passing I will note that if I close out of this and observe that the other major tweakable setup for any oscillator is, or any soundscape, is what's labelled as the filter tab, and then we get into this thing that looks like the Star Trek sickbay. That is kind of confusing. That's why earlier I said that would probably be better labelled FX, and the reason it's confusing is going back into that oscillator setup, we actually have, independently of that, a free low pass filter and a free high pass filter. Those are set up in the oscillator, not in the filter dialog. I hope that makes sense. So coming back to the bottom right of this dialog, if we look for the one that's labelled balance, we can set for each of these parameters that are associated with this oscillator, we can either set an envelope, which we'll get to, or we can set, as in this case, an LFO. So looking at the balance, if I click on the one that says LFO, there's a green flash that tells you that's active. We get to the LFO setup screen. Now there are 6 LFOs. Number 3 is selected. Again, this is like a tabbed dialog, if you like. 3 is selected. The word assign is lit up, which says it's assigned to this parameter. The parameter it's assigned to is noted in the title bar of this dialog, and it's, if you look at the bottom left there, the rate of that LFO is 9 seconds. The depth is about half of the range, and it's on a sine wave. If I just change that to a square wave and close that, we should see that LFO now flip-flops, and it's a rate of 9 seconds forget, so every 4.5 seconds that should flip. What's immediately obvious as well from that change is that all 3 of those, the balance for all 3 layers is controlled by that same LFO. And I say that because it's obvious that they've all changed to a square wave. Now when I was describing the setup of the balance parameter for layer 2, I noted that the orange triangle is the starting point and the green triangle is the current point. Now that green triangle can be modified under the control of various things. The LFO is the one I've demonstrated. We'll look at another example for one of the other parameters in a moment. But in general, I think this is a generalization that holds. Wherever you see 2 superimposed things in the colours green and orange, the orange is a template and or a starting point, and the green is the actual or current dynamic value. Hopefully that made sense. We've got another example here which you'll notice, sticking with the top 120 degree arc, so layer 2, you notice there's an orange dashed segment to the outer radius of that circle, and above that there's a green segment. You might also notice, if you've got a keen eye, that the right hand end of that green segment is moving. Well, if you wait a second, there it goes. It's moving slightly. So that suggests another LFO is at work. So that dashed arc denotes the cutoff frequencies for the low pass filter at the right hand end of the arc, which I can click and drag, or the high pass filter at the left hand end of that arc, which I can click and drag. And the green, and so that's the target, so that's the current setting of the high pass filter. And if you look at the text to the left of that arc, you'll see that L for the low pass filter is changing, so 7.9 kilohertz. We should be able to demonstrate that by playing the tone and varying that. Oops. I'm trying to hold the same note down. I'm actually let me use the MIDI keyboard. If I hold that, oops, I'm changing the balance now. So I'm dragging the right hand end of that arc, and that's clearly changing the low pass cutoff. If I drag the left hand end, that should change the high pass cutoff. So we're losing all the low frequencies there. So that's what that arc does. So where we had the triangle indicator for the balance, we've actually got that outer arc is the indicator for the current position of the low pass filter. And if we look down to the right hand edge of this dialog and look for the low pass filter parameter, again, sure enough, we'll see that it's got an LFO. There's a green flash against the LFO and it says LFO 5. So if I click on that, again, it's on a sine wave, 10-second cycle. If I change that cycle to be 5 seconds, we should see a difference there. It should speed up. It's a sine wave, so it's sort of, you got acceleration and deceleration at the extremes. If I go back in and change that to a square wave, we should see that flip flap. Oh, if I make that faster, where am I going? If I put the rate down to 1 second, so we're now getting that flip flap. Right. So that's the balance, that's the low pass filter, the high pass filter. Again, looking at this table of parameters at the bottom right, balance, low pass, high pass, that leaves us with pitch, address and level. Now level, if you look towards the centre of this radial diagram, and again focusing on the top segment for layer 2, there's a solid orange segment of the circle which, if you click and drag, moves in and out. Now that denotes the level parameter, and if it's towards if I play it just as it's set now, and then if I drag it towards the centre, sorry, I'll do that again because I need to mute layers 1 and 3. So we're only hearing layer 2. If I drag that towards the centre, play it again, it's quieter. Drag it almost to the centre, very quiet. If I drag it right out, it's louder. So that's the target for the level. But you'll also notice two other things. The level swells in, and that's suspiciously in step with that green animation. And if you've got a very keen eye, you'll also notice it gets to the outside and then it sort of rebounds. So what's going on there? Well, if we look at the table of parameters, we'll notice that as well as the LFO, in fact we'll turn off the LFO by clicking onto it and clicking assign off. We just play that sound again and watch the animation. There's no rebound. We still get the sweat. Well, actually, there's a slight rebound, but it's different quality. So if we click on the env, this shows us that that parameter actually follows an envelope, which is triggered when we hit the key. We don't have any animation on this screen. Now that envelope, if you know about envelopes, we've got ADSR, so we have a kind of a slow attack. We've got a little bit of decay, but quite a high sustain, so that's subtle. Then we've got a long release, so that kind of matches what we hear and what we see on the animation. Now what you can do is you can change this envelope by tweaking. It'd be nice if you could click on the screen and drag them. You can't do that. You have to change these sliders. If we change the attack just by dragging that down to be very fast, we should see that behave significantly differently. So the swelling is very much curtailed. You get a very fast attack. And because we hear that as well as seeing it, we go back in there. If we change the sustain to be lower, we should get a fast attack, then a fast kind of rebound, and then it should settle kind of halfway out. This is what it does. We are hearing some variation, but that may be because of the sample. Yeah, again, that sample has a sort of phasing effect already built in. So what else can we say about the envelope? Well, as well as designing your own envelopes, you can select from a series of standard ones. There's a button over to the right of this dialog called default. If I press that and just keep pressing it, we get a number of kind of template envelopes which are, you know, very usable. So if we choose, let's see, that's a fast attack and a no decay and a very long release. So we'll try that one. Oh, it's not a very long release. Okay. It would be if it was over a long. I mean, that's relatively. So if the scale is half a second. If we change the, can we change that scale? How do we change the scale? Just by changing the length of the release. Okay, that's 3 seconds, so we'll try that. Okay, let's choose a different effect for the envelope. Let's choose an obvious one. That should have a kick at the start. Let's choose a very obvious one. Actually, an annoyance there, when you click that after coming back in, it always starts from the start of the list. It doesn't start where you left off. Let's choose, that'll be a very obvious one. That's over 3 seconds, so it should be a very gradual swell in and swell out. And if we make the target as loud as it can go, now what I did there was changing the target to 100% of the range, and you'll see that that green template, sorry, that green envelope now sits right on top of the orange one. If I just go and change that slider to be slightly below maximum, go back in, you see the two curves don't align. So again, the orange is the template. I'm not sure how to explain this, but it's the curve. You know, if the curve was over the whole range available, that's what the orange denotes. If we constrain that by modifying, it's like the depth parameter really, the allowable depth of that transformation is only, in this case, about a half of the theoretically available range. So that's just another example of the template and the actual. If that was on an LFO as well, which actually it was until we turned it off, let's go and enable that again. We should see, let's change that LFO to be more obvious. We should see both of those things now impact on the, let's change that envelope back to something more rational. That's just a very straightforward, in fact no, let's have a one with a bit of a rebound there. We'll try that. So there you go, you get that initial envelope with that first rebound is the decay. Let's make that LFO a bit longer just to emphasize that. So the first rebound, that fast one, is the decay. Let's make that decay more obvious as well. Decay, now sustain level, take that down. Alright, try that again. And then we're seeing that LFO controlling the level. So we've covered level, balance, low pass filter, high pass filter. We've covered LFOs applied to the dynamic manipulation of those parameters while the note is playing. We've covered the application of the envelope, of an envelope to one of those parameters. Anything more to say about the envelope? There's more stuff, you know, I'm not going to go through everything on this screen. You can, you know, this is just enormously flexible, as you'd expect. You can change the, you know, that curve is currently a linear attack and decay. You can change those by pressing those buttons to exponential or logarithmic, which are more, you know, arguably a more aesthetic. It's kind of like choosing between a sawtooth wave and a sine wave. You get some smoothing out. Just before we look at the last two parameters, if you direct your attention to the top right of this screen, of this dialog, there's a couple of other, well, there's four other options. You can look at what fixed octave, fixed note. Well, I'll just briefly say what they are. If you choose fixed octave, then it doesn't matter which octave I play on the keyboard. Okay, fixed octave, and then select an octave. Okay, if you select an octave, click fixed octave, select an octave. It doesn't matter where I play on the keyboard, it will play that note but in octave 5. So if that's a G up here, next one down, it's also a G. If I play something down there, it's in the same octave. If I play an A, that's what fixed octave does. Fixed note is probably something similar. Yes, it plays a C wherever I play. I'm actually playing an F, a D. So So it's now just playing a C, but in the octave that I'm playing within. So some applications for that. Microtonal, I'm not going to go into that because I don't really understand what that does. Degrade, that's an interesting one there. Basically mangles the sample. Okay, we'll take a look at the last two parameters that we can control from this oscillator screen. We'll look at pitch first. It should be fairly obvious what that does. Pitch is not denoted on this radial diagram, but of course it is available or visible on these three knobs or dials at the top. That's what we're modifying. So if we put that on an LFO, let's make it blatant. We've got a sine wave. This is LFO 1. Let me see. LFO 1 is not assigned to anything. So if we change this to have a rate of 3 seconds, depth 44. It's a sine wave. I've not done this from scratch. Let's just try assigning. I think I might have to set the range then to LFO to parameter. So we'll give that. So it's going to vary 100% of 44.5% of the available range. Is that right? I'm not really sure. We'll try that. Doesn't seem to be doing anything. Let's mute layers 2 and 3, 1 and 3. There you go. So we've set the amount to vary between plus 25%, minus 40% over 3 seconds using 100% of 50% of something. I don't know, but we're getting, and the, oh yes, 100% of 50% of plus or minus 1800 cents. And if we change the wave to be a, let's say, a triangle, so, square, there's a random, there's a randomized parameter which was on there by default. So there you go. That's, you can do all sorts of subtleties with that idea. That's controlling the pitch parameter. The last parameter that we can control is very weird and wonderful. This thing in the middle, this sort of purple grid pattern with the slider. Again, we've got an orange slider and a green slider. We'll come to those in a second. We've got a row of LED lights, if you like, at the top. Now this should be starting to be familiar if you've used SynthScaper or FieldScaper. This is the notorious address mangling. We've got what is nominally a 20-bit address, and the 20 bits are denoted by, well, those indicators at the top. And also, this is different from SynthScaper and FieldScaper. We can design our own bit masks. So if you click these buttons on, what this is going to do is, depending on the setting of this switch here, it's going to apply some sort of address mangling algorithm to the sound. So this is, in some sense, interfering with the retrieval of the sample from memory before any of the processing gets done. So if we just try that, let's just see what sound we're going to... Don't like that, it's too high. So that's the sound that we've got on layer 2 of this preset on oscillator 3. If we start to, if we set this switch for the addressing to set 0, and then we, in fact let's turn off, if we just put in a bunch of bits, hold down the note, click set 0, it's doing something very weird to the sound. I'm just playing different notes. I do that on the keyboard. I change some of those bits, change the algorithm by clicking the button over here, set 1, set 0, invert. Then again, if you've used SynthScaper or SoundScaper, you should understand quickly that that slider below is actually is a shift. In fact, you can see it, it's shifting that bitmap, which has been interpreted as an address left and right. So if I just do that live, so that gives you all sorts of weird and wonderful ideas, but of course you can animate that. But that's all pretty much the parameters that we have available to set on the oscillators. And don't forget, we can set this for each layer within each oscillator, and each layer within each oscillator can have a different sample attached to it. So the last thing we need to look at really is the filter tab, which, as I've said a number of times, really is the effects setup dialog. Again, we've got this individually for each of 3 oscillators. If I choose a different one with some animation in it, I'll go back to the falling clouds one. I think that one's got some animation in there. Yeah. So you'll see, I mean, these radial displays are similar obviously to the ones in the oscillator setup tab, and you know, I won't go through these in detail. Once you understand how that dialog works, you'll understand how these work. The difference is, depending on which effect you choose, you know, those sliders will mean different things. So for example, well, let's look at this. At the moment we've got 3 effect slots, if you like, and at the moment they're chained left to right. Well, they're not actually. If I go to oscillator 1, they are chained left to right. So we've got a low pass filter. If you look at the dashed square rectangular box at the top of each slot, we've got a low pass filter of that. Now, I mean, the range of effects available is, you know, quite large. So low pass ladder filter, low pass distortion, we've got delay, ping pong delay, amplitude modulation, chorus, phaser. So we've got a low pass filter, we've got a high pass filter in the next slot, we've got a classic delay in the slot after that. And so the parameters for each of those make sense. If we look at the low pass filter, for example, we've got we've got the triangle, I guess is the target, or the current, yeah, the target, which is 2.3 kilohertz. Now this is interesting because this will refer back to something we had before. There's no animation on that cutoff frequency. So at the moment that green triangle is exactly opposite the orange triangle. But we'll notice there's an envelope set for this effect. If I go in and just disable that temporarily, now play a note. So the low pass filter basically is static. This is the now bearing in mind something else I said earlier, which is this is in addition to the low pass filter that we get for free on the oscillator setup itself. this is an independent effect that is added to the end of the chain, but it's static. It's not animated. We could put an LFO on it. Okay, we've now got that low pass filter on an LFO. So you can see that cycling. Now the difference is subtle, you probably can't hear that. If I mute the other two. Well, you're not going to hear it on that particular sample anyway. So that's, again, we can animate those parameters. The resonance is the other thing we can animate with this one. If I just animate that by dragging the slider, let's try that on a different oscillator. Let's try it on that one. That sounds easier. Now what you'll notice is when I switch oscillators, we get a separate effects chain for each oscillator, which it's just another mind-boggling layer of complexity. So this is oscillator 2. If I just play with the resonance, it's not doing much. If I change the filter frequency first, now tinkering with the resonance, so you can see how that's going to work. And again, we can animate that with an envelope or an LFO or both. And that's before we even get into the next effects in the chain. If we go back to oscillator 1 and mute the other two, you'll see that the next effect is a high pass filter. Not quite sure why that makes sense. And then we've got a delay added to the end. Let's just tinker with the delay. So that's the delay. And the only other thing to say about this is the order in which the effects are applied. At the moment, if you look at that arrow that starts at the top left, it chains the effects together. So these three effects are applied in series. If you look at the buttons between the effects halfway down the box, the first one is, I'll toggle it on and off here. That's the 1 to 2 button. That's effect 1 to effect 2. Toggles between in series or in parallel. So I think what happens here is the low pass filter and the high pass filter are applied to the signal in parallel, and the output of that goes into the delay. But again, we can have the delay effect in parallel as well. Let's just see what difference that makes. They're all in parallel. Well, those differences are subtle. Let's try it on the oscillator 2. That's got a high pass and then a flanger and then another flanger, and the two flangers are running in parallel. I guess the flanger, running the flangers in series doesn't make sense. So there's a difference there. If you try oscillator 3, that's low pass, chorus, flanger, all in series. So that makes a difference as well, but you can experiment with that at your leisure. So that's pretty much it for SynthScaper. I've really only just started playing with this app over the last, 3 or 4 days. And I mean, it's just, you can just get lost in this. It's astonishingly complex in the detail. And it really is something where you need to experiment. You can plan to construct a soundscape on paper. But when you start to do it, that's when the richness comes out. You get all sorts of unexpected effects, and once you start to layer these things on top of each other, it's just completely unpredictable in the detail. So it's just they could ship this with one preset, and you could just lose yourself for weeks in experimenting with that one preset. It's really good to just take something like this and pull it apart. This has only got 2 oscillators in, the third one's muted. If we went into this and looked at the setup, in fact, I think this one, if we go in the filter setup, oscillator setup, there's something I didn't point out. We can mute each of the effects. Well, that's interesting. It's got a nice left-right delay effect in there, which was off by default. I like that. What else have we got that sounds good? Let's just play a few of these. Crystal Planet. Arpeggios, we'll just take a very brief look at. This one has an arpeggio on oscillator 1. I mean, this is a nice sound on its own anyway. But if we just disable oscillators 2 and 3 and we go into oscillator 1, got that nice chiming. But you can see it's repeating as I hold the key down. If we go out of there, press the ARP button, we get all sorts of parameters here. It's random over plus, I think, the main octave -1 and +1. If we put it to, so that's random. If we go up, down, no, if we go up, if we put in an extra octave, we can change, again they've got this radial control panel, we can change the swing, the swing parameter. We can change the glide and randomize it. The gate parameter, that truncates the sound. Well, that should be familiar if you've used to sequencing or arpeggiating. So there it is. I think I will leave it there. That's SynthScaper from Igor Vasiliev. Absolutely amazing application and highly recommended. Give it a try.